Well, today I'm speaking with Jim McMurtry. And Jim, you are a Canadian teacher who has, I think you have now been terminated from your teaching position over some issues relating to the Kamloops history, the residential schools. And I you and I were introduced through a mutual friend because I specifically wanted to speak with somebody a little bit about these issues and understand more about what's going on with Kamloops, with the mass grave theory or hypothesis or whatever it is. I guess it's almost a policy statement that you're supposed to believe this thing. And with the land acknowledgements that are going on in Canada, I think I don't know that much about what is going on there. And I don't know how many people in the United States do. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about it and understand the history of this. And you were recommended as somebody who knows this issue very well. I've since listened to a couple of interviews with you, and they've been really, I've been shocked by what I'm hearing. So thank you so much for speaking with me and for going into this issue with me.
Well, you're very welcome, and it's delightful to be with you, Leslie. Um, I'd like to just maybe mention that I feel I'm a little bit of an authority on the subject of Indian residential schools. And I know there was the equivalent in the United States. And the belief in Canada for some time is that they were atrocious. But the evidence points in a different direction. And so, but it's not politically correct. It's not a good time to be going against that narrative.
Mhm.
And my own particular case is interesting because news came out, and I don't know how many American audiences know about this, but the story did go worldwide, and you've already made reference to it. But that in one school near where I was working, in Kamloops, British Columbia, there were 215 child remains found
Mhm.
in a mass grave. And the suggestion was not just through the term mass grave, but the suggestion was very clearly that they were murdered, and that there were even 6-year-old recruits at the school used late at night to secretly bury these 215 children. And some of the children were said to be as young as 3, which
Oh.
is a little bit inexplicable because kids didn't go to school usually until 7, 8, or 9
Mm.
um, in these schools. So I, rightly or wrongly, I guess, depending on what I looked at, I've been out of work since, so maybe wrongly. Because I did do a doctorate at the University of Toronto in the area of Indian educational policy and other things relating to our past Canadian educational history, and it just didn't make any sense to me. I'd never heard of a murder at a residential school, and there are about 150 such schools over 150 years. So the idea that in one school alone there were 215 murders and that nobody knew about it, and there never was even a parent letter saying that I'm missing my child, and then soon after I realized that the RCMP, our police, the national police, weren't going to investigate and still haven't investigated. So the whole thing seemed to be, to me, rather nonsensical. But what I said in class that day when the news broke was that the children who died were enrolled in these schools, and some did die, as they died in other schools from things like Spanish flu and diphtheria and cholera and all sorts of things, smallpox,
Mhm.
going back a little bit further, but particularly the turn of the century, um, tuberculosis, and it was tragic. But the men and women in this particular residential school, there were as many female teachers as there were male nuns from the Sisters of Saint Anne and oblate priests, and also an awful lot of indigenous native staff, yes, supervisors, caretakers, cooks, and so forth. So the idea that this was, as it's being presented in Canada, as some sort of mass genocide,
Mhm.
the on October 27, 2022, the Canadian government, all the sitting members of Parliament in Ottawa voted to call residential schools a genocide. So I'm just providing a little bit of context. So little old me said that day that it wasn't murder, it was disease, in my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't taught since. So I was walked out by two vice principals, walked out of the school. And and so I'm still fighting for my vindication. I feel I have some because I've got followers on Twitter and I've managed to write articles and be the subject of some articles and interviews like this one right here. So I feel that that I've had an opportunity since, never by my employer, but since to be heard, and it means a lot to me, and as does this particular interview, because there's another side to all this, and I think it's very dangerous and quite Orwellian to erase the past or to lie to children about the past.
Mm-hmm. So it it sounds like there was no real evidence pointing to murder at all in this case. Like from what I understand, there's not even clear evidence to this date that those are actually mass graves in that particular school, that there was a ground survey done and they found disturbances under the ground that could be all kinds of things, could be construction, could be graves, could be who knows what, and that the only way to find that out, to determine conclusively what it is, would be to do an excavation, but an excavation hasn't happened. So we have no clear evidence that there is a mass grave site, and then even on top of that, no clear evidence that if there were, it would be deaths due to murder. And yet the parliament has voted to call it a genocide.
And not just what happened at this one school, but at all the schools. But at none of the schools have they found a single missing child, a single grave that was unmarked, any evidence whatsoever pointing to um, foul play by teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Most extraordinary for me is that they in Kamloops, when people started to argue back a little bit about the story, which the Washington Post and the New York Times picked up using the terms mass grave, and so around the whole world, everybody was thinking these Christian missionaries and teachers in Canada were monstrous, equivalent to the Nazis who orchestrated the final solution of the Jews in the Second World War. And it's just so different from what the record shows. The record shows that they were highly devoted people who did their best to provide Indigenous Native children with a chance
Mm-hmm.
to be successful in the modern world, and they should be commended and not be the objects of a blood libel.
Mm-hmm.
So, just one specific in Kamloops, they've never dug. So you're right. So they have no idea what's there.
Mm-hmm.
The 215 markings from a GPR, ground penetrating radar, and analysis. It's all they're just one straight line. Um, so people believe anyhow, it's just a drainage, a tile,
Mm-hmm.
sewage tiles from an old 1924 septic bed. Anyhow, there's nothing mysterious about it. It could also be something else. It could be an underground line for electricity. It could be lots of different things, or nothing. It could be roots and rocks, or absolutely nothing, because pretty much everywhere you point at one of those radar things, you're going to find some disturbance, some anomaly, something that's, and particularly in areas where people have lived for a long time. And this reserve, the residential school, is also in the middle of the reserve, right in the middle of the reserve. So
Mm-hmm.
again, a lot of the staff are Indigenous,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually, in later years, there was even an Indigenous principal, and that never spoke about any of this. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea that this was a killing field, this apple orchard outside of the school where these things were found. So what it does is it fits a narrative, Leslie, as you well know, and the narrative is that people dreamed up. I don't really understand it fully. All these fancy words are used like postmodernism and deconstructionism and now decolonialism. And anyhow, there's a movement afoot to make Western civilization look pretty bad.
Mhm.
and to make others, those who were less successful in the clash of civilizations, because there certainly was a clash of civilizations, and continues to be obviously around the world. We all cultures aren't getting along, as we all know. But they want to present certain minorities as being terribly treated and so forth.
Mhm.
And I think that makes no sense to me, because I think my job as a teacher, and I think most people's jobs, in whatever you're doing, is to get at the truth and go from there. I mentioned Orwell already,
Mhm.
and Big Brother was all about presenting Big Brother well
Mhm.
in the present, and so that's what our prime minister is all about. And not that, and predecessors were similar, but he's just, to me, taken it to a greater extent. But he's got this idea, and then just in the news, if you can believe it, yesterday he was Justin Trudeau was saying how Canada has to make atonement for its history of slavery, because it was Emancipation Day. And anyhow, this is just something that
Mm.
Canada now recognizes. And Canada didn't have any slaves.
That's what I was
And
wondering. I've never
uh,
heard about that.
and before Canada became a country, it was two colonies, and one of them, which is now called Ontario, but at the time it was called Upper Canada, it had in 1793 an act of toward abolishing slavery, because there was remnants of slavery. Some people that moved in Upper Canada had slaves with them. Canada has a long history, not just Canada, but before Canada became a country in 1867, is known as British North America. It has a long history of, of legislating and fighting, and quite heroically against slavery, the Underground Railroad, and so forth. So why would our prime minister be standing out yesterday and saying Canada has this bad? And the British Empire was the second after Denmark to ban slavery in the world in 1833, officially 1834. So this idea, it just doesn't make sense. And then where I live in British Columbia, I'm just the province generally, but up the coast, there was a very active slave network up into almost a century ago. And approximately a quarter of Northwest Coast Indians, natives, indigenous people were slaves
Mm.
to their own people.
Mm.
And then you probably have heard the five civilized tribes, the Cherokee and Choctaw and so on. They had black slaves, and in addition to slaves from other native groupings. So I'm not trying to excuse slavery. And I think it's important we look back and condemn it wherever it was found. But why would anyone want to condemn the one country or one culture that has worked the hardest to eradicate slavery? We and the Danes, I guess. But so the indigenous thing is the same thing. And I think it's happening in the US as well. That people are wanting to make it look as though early European white society was quite monstrous with indigenous people. And the record is in Canada, there were no wars, there were no massacres. There was the only wars that did happen in the West were between people who were French Canadian or part French Canadian, called Métis as well, fighting over land.
Mm.
And but they were people who were part European, and it was really more of two groups: Catholic French against Protestant Scots in particular. So this idea of Canada being terrible is not true. And when the buffalo disappeared, pretty much disappeared right across North America, and that was most deeply felt in Canada in the early 1880s. And so what does one do? And so Canada officially already had some schools for Indigenous kids, but it really came together and tried to think of what we could do to raise the quality of life, and for a group of people who were starving and suffering in so many other untold ways. And one of the ideas was in 1883 is build a lot more of these schools, and we'll call them residential schools. And it's for kids who can't go to schools in their own community because their community is too small, or there's or they're not anywhere near a public school. So in the north and the west of Canada, in rural and particular wilderness areas, where a lot of the native bands, the indigenous groupings, were living hand to mouth pretty much, trapping and hunting, fishing, gathering, digging. It's like it wasn't easy. And so there wasn't an opportunity for those kids to go to school. So over the course of our history in Canada, when these schools were around, about a third of Indigenous children went to a residential school. About a third went to a day school, whether on a reserve that was big enough or to one in a Canadian town or city, just a regular public school. And also a third of Indigenous or Native children never went to school. And the ones they say in the residential schools, the kids were taken by their mothers and all that stuff. And that's just not true. There was nobody that was forced, except there were some kids who were neglected, orphaned, without the necessities of life, who were protected by being placed in these schools. But the vast majority of the third that went to residential school were there because their parents signed an application form to have them there.
Mm-hmm. So it wasn't compulsory, as you say, it was an option.
Well, thank you for making that point. That's so important. So how can it be genocide, first of all, if it wasn't something that was forced upon people? And again, the fact that a third of the most ever was there, a third of the kids in these schools and serving kids that couldn't otherwise have an education. When education became compulsory in Canada, it was in 1871. It was 49 years later, in 1920, that it became compulsory for Indigenous children, for Native children as well. So 49 years is a long time that maybe a lot of people would argue it should have been compulsory, but it wasn't. And when it was made compulsory, it was never, and thank you for allowing me to say this with enough time to give it its due, and that is that they were told they had to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't told they had to go to residential school, and their families in Kamloops on the reserve, where they had this now infamous residential school, who didn't school their kids at the residential school, even though it was right in the middle of the reserve.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to do it across the river, right in downtown Kamloops, in a regular Canadian school.
Mm-hmm.
They had that choice.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting, as you say, you're talking about the history of slavery in Canada, and much of that history was among Indigenous peoples themselves, it sounds like. And that we have this tendency, it seems, at least in popular discourse, to really idealize and almost infantilize Native cultures and create a story that is very black and white around Indigenous people being protectors of the land and peaceful and very spiritual, and then the Europeans coming through and being these warring, greedy, colonialists that took over. And I grew up with this picture in my mind, and it was, I think for a lot of people who grow up in or who live in really urban or suburban environments where things are ugly, there's crisscrosses of highway everywhere, and shopping malls and strip malls and another Bed Bath and Beyond and another mattress firm. It's easy to look at this and think the land has been destroyed by people doing all of this needless building. Why is our culture taking over this way? And these giant, now it's like these 5G towers, they're so ugly. There's just no attention paid to aesthetics. And so you can really sort of fall in love with this romanticized version of the past, where things would have been pastoral and beautiful, and these more back to the land, or not back, but just land-based, more primitive societies would have had a much more natural existence. And to villainize the Europeans that came over and changed that for North America, So I think that it seems like, and I did very much grow up with that, this pain of thinking about the Trail of Tears and the displacement of Indian tribes in North America. But it's really not the whole story. And it's not fair to paint it that way. And it's really strange when you get a government like this parliamentary decision that says it doesn't matter what you think, we've decided this is what you're going to think, and we're going to just keep to that very black and white image. European colonialists bad, natives good, and don't you dare say anything different.
I think, well, first of all, I'm not going to be able to speak as beautifully as you just spoke. I think my particular expertise and experiences as a teacher, school teacher. So they allow me to keep it in that context.
Mm-hmm.
I loved what you said about it's not the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there were some indigenous people who were living in an Eden,
Mm-hmm.
who lived in with abundance of food, who lived peacefully with their neighbors, and who had a life that we can only romanticize about today. I've never had seen documentation of that. I don't think that's real. Um, I think starvation was visited upon all groupings before capitalism, and certainly before the agrarian revolution that began in England. And I think we're pretty lucky to be living in the 21st century. So anybody who thinks to go back in time and find use your word pastoral to find sort of to find some sort of um, again paradise that on earth um, where Walden on Walden Park Pond or whatever, it just doesn't, it just never existed, and I don't think it really ever will exist. We as humans have our failings and things like the seven deadly sins and our desire to compete with others and take from others and in some cases harm others is sadly not going to go away. And back in time, it was poorly regulated. Canada has a pretty, in my view, pretty beautiful past compared to most countries because of the police, because there was a national police force that was created that went out and did its best to try and solve problems between the different factions, which were French and British, which were, of course, European together against indigenous people against each other, wealthy farm owners against poor itinerant people, famished who just made their way from Europe and were trying to survive. And there are just so many different groups of people in the U.S. and in Canada back in time, and how do they fit into this reductive Manichaean conception of history being Europeans bad and all others good? I don't. It just makes no sense. I thank you for saying that. But as a teacher, you can't think for yourself, and you can't think in a nuance way. I was even one of the allegations against me by an employer is that I was being nuanced
Mm.
because they want a
Wow.
message, the message to children. Well, yeah, I understand it because I've seen it before. All the ideologies that want to take root, that want to capture, particularly young people,
Yeah.
they can't. You can't make it complex because then it becomes more difficult to, I guess, to imbibe. And so yeah, just the world we live in. I think it's really difficult to describe it without being nuanced and without pointing out its complexity. And that's what I try and do as a teacher, and I know many others. But you have to be very careful on certain issues. During the American George Floyd moment in 2020, you've got that right. It wasn't a time to say, well, there are a lot of white police officers who are pretty good people. Now that's an honest statement, but it wasn't a time to say it. And I guess in Russia right now, it's not a good time to say that the special military operation is a disaster for Russia. So we have that totalitarian impulse with us. and it comes with every government, and from the left and from the right. And I'm just really sickened by it because what we have in schools right now, and not so much now, because I think we've moved. I think they may use the word woke, progressive, whatever one word politically correct, whatever everyone wants to call this edifice. I think it's starting to fracture and crumble a little bit. But up to a year ago, where I live, there were drag queens in schools performing for kids in a very sexual way. Men who are clearly getting aroused by doing it. They were putting everybody into, the critical race theory, putting everybody into
Mm-hmm.
race boxes and getting rid of all literature. Recently, where I live, within the last couple of months, they got rid of, and it took them longer than others, of the most loved book in North America. Certainly, poll after poll in the US is To Kill a Mockingbird is the
Mm-hmm.
most, and so it's just amazing the onslaught in schools, the lowering of standards, behaviorally as well as academically, falsification of history, and I could speak for some time. But the one that I represent, um, again, unwittingly, is that they're lying about our past with regard to Indigenous people. That Canada freely educated large swaths of the Indigenous population and tried to educate all of them. Were
Mm-hmm.
unsuccessful at that, but did its best. And I think there should be a lot of gratitude. Instead, our very own government is paying out, and you're going to find the sum rather enormous. But it's not just in the tens of billions of dollars every year. So Canada spends about 30 billion a
Mm-hmm.
year on Indigenous people. So just on one group, no other group gets this. So one group, and the federal government has a special relationship with the Native people. But there's all sorts of tens of billions of dollars and sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars being given away to Indigenous groupings because
Mm-hmm.
of things like residential schools. And one well-noted writer in Canada, journalist, political figure named Conrad Black, made the assessment that over Canada's history, it amounts to close to 5 trillion. 5 trillion the Canadian government has given to one group of people. And a lot of people are upset in part because it's not working. Because what they're doing is they're keeping Indigenous people in a childlike state as wards of the state. They have all sorts of special rights, and in many cases they don't have to work. They take taxes, they have to pay tuition, they don't have to do all sorts of things, and I think ultimately that can become quite corrosive. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, I would say on average, Indigenous people are less well off than ordinary Canadians, but there's some groupings that are much richer. But let's say on average, they're less well off. And the answer isn't just to forever give them more money, it's to create the framework in which their people can be successful, which is better getting their kids to stay in school, getting their kids off drugs and alcohol. Having fewer fetal alcohol syndrome children is probably the number one scourge in
Mm-hmm.
Canadian reservations, or we call them reserves. Reservations is the term you guys use. And then there are also all sorts of other problems, suicide and
Mm-hmm.
unemployment and so forth. And I think if you really want to help people, you help them as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
You don't look at a whole group of people and say, "Oh, these people are favored and therefore, privileged. Therefore, we have to do less for them, and these other people are less favored. Therefore, they're victims and oppressed." And I just think it's absolute nonsense. I think, particularly as a teacher, you look at the kids in the classroom as individuals and you try to do your best and to help. And I think Canadians are highly motivated to help all groups, in particular, and Indigenous groups, but more particularly in Indigenous individuals. But I don't know if the government is. The government seems to be about interested in something else. And I think it's the natural human tendency to want to look good. And I think politicians feel that they look good by coming to the side of the underdog. And
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Black people in the United States or Indigenous people in Canada or whomever, and and doing a lot for them.
Mm-hmm.
And to make their case, they falsify. So there's all sorts of horrible things in the US in recent decades, particularly in the last decade, saying about white people, and
Mhm.
same in Canada. And if you look at it a bit more closely, you go, well, what about all the white people? What about all the people of European ancestry who've devoted their lives trying to help people in less successful, more vulnerable, or more needy communities? I just think it's just so wrong. And so just tying it all together for me, is it right, Leslie? And I know this is rhetorical. Um, that someone like me will never teach again.
Mhm.
Um, I'm I was a good teacher. I won teaching awards. I know kids love me as a teacher. Maybe not every child, but so many. And I volunteered. I was just always doing extra things at school. Um, and nobody wants to hire me. So I'm completely banned from the profession in Canada. And it comes from one thing. It's just an inability to lie to children. If 215 children were murdered at a school near where I was teaching, I would want the people responsible for that to be
Mhm.
held accountable.
Mhm.
And what a farce. Not only have they not dug, the police are not investigating after, again, 3.5 years, but everybody know, and now even the band itself, the tribe has said, the First Nation has said, well, we recognize they weren't bodies found.
Mhm.
But nobody's going back and correcting the historical record. And the New York
Mhm.
Times, the Washington Post has changed a little bit, but the New York Times hasn't changed its original article.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of people that want to falsify history to better serve the narrative
Mhm.
and maybe their own careers, because it's virtue signaling. It's look at me, everybody. I'm doing this for this group, and um, and I'm different from all other people, because who are terrible. All the previous prime ministers in Canada were terrible because they had residential schools for Indigenous kids. But look at me. Look at me. I'm telling everybody how bad they were. Um, but is it even better today? Is it better to tell Indigenous people that they were terribly treated and murdered by Canadian teachers?
You know, what's astounding about it to me is the hypocrisy, because it's if the genocide or the supposed harm that was visited on Indigenous people, and I I do get some of the point. I'm sympathetic to some extent to a point that I hear made, which is that if you take people away from their culture and you replace their culture with a new set of cultural understanding, a new language, don't allow them to teach their or to speak their original language, force them to learn a new language, that you've taken away something of their past from them and replaced it with a new ideological um, perspective. I am sympathetic to that for the purposes of the schooling of Native peoples in North America. I don't know that much about that history and that perspective, but if you give me that argument, I can say that that does seem like there's a loss there. Same as I think in Great Britain, didn't they do that with the Welsh as well? They kind of just drowned out their native languages by forcing them to speak something that's more homogenous and learn the more culturally official language and set of norms and customs. So I'm sympathetic to that, but that's exactly what these people are doing right now. That it's exactly the same pattern that they're implementing right now. They're saying you can't teach the way that you would have taught 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We're implementing a new ideology and we're going to stamp out the way people previously looked at things. We're going to create a new historical record. So if they're calling out this old colonialism, but they're replacing it with new colonialism and forcing everybody to think in one particular way. So they the moral bankruptcy of that is it's just quite bold and incredibly hypocritical what's happening right now. And no, it doesn't seem right at all that somebody who just wants to speak in terms of nuance should be shut down for that nuance. For you're not indoctrinating, you're engaging the students' minds in learning. I homeschool my children. That's how I teach my kids, is through questions. It's very Socratic. We talk a lot about things. We read things. We look at different perspectives. And then it's not about me getting them to parrot back to me a line or an attitude or a perspective on something. It's about, here's a bunch of information. What do you think? How do you make up your mind about it?
Well, you make raise so many important things. I, uh, I don't know where to start in response, but allow me to say a couple of things that first of all, my name, I go by Jim McMurtry, but was James. The first James McMurtry in my family um, came over speaking a different language, Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and had dances and food and clothing and all sorts of things that had a culture.
Mm-hmm.
That's all lost.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in my family that is indicative in any way of our roots. And our roots, of course, are from other places as well. But so I think, rightly or wrongly, I think that's what happens to all groups eventually, is
Mm-hmm.
that we become part of that monolithic. And Harari and other historians talk about it. There's this universal culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth resisting. And you make some wonderful points. I think the more we can do to retain difference, true diversity, I think just makes the world richer. So everything you say, I agree with. At the same time, I'd like to make the point that if I'm sitting in a classroom where I live, outside of Vancouver, which in an immigrant area, I've had classes where there's no child who's of European ancestry, and a lot from India, but from other places as well. Nobody. And what we're supposed to do is not have the kids speak Punjabi or
Mm-hmm.
whatever their language, or Urdu or whatever. They cannot, they have to conform.
Mm-hmm.
They have to conform to Canadian society. They have to learn not just English, they have to go to school, they have to develop these things. If they start doing things that might be normal in their culture, which is treating women a little bit worse than treating men, because that's, uh, I had a lot of, for example, Sikh Punjabi boys with names like Lucky and Money, and every time there was a boy that was born to a student, one of the families, one of my students, there was excitement, and they called it Lori when a boy was born. It's a big party when there's a girl born. It's not
No.
so exciting, and so it's hard, but it's hard. Homosexuality. If I've got Muslim kids and Sikh kids and kids from all sorts of parts of the world and Africa and so forth who don't accept homosexuality, what is a Canadian teacher supposed to do? Well, I can tell you what to do. You have to tell them to accept homosexuality, or you're in big trouble as a teacher because it's the law. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
law that I support in
Mm-hmm.
Canada. I think people should be able to love differently. And so I don't think really Canada is any different than it was during when these residential schools were around. I think we still take kids from around the world and we teach them English and French, and we teach them how to manage in Canada. We teach them our values, their morals, their mores, and to fit in. We don't want women to be abused, including in the classroom. And so we stamp these things out. We stamp out anything. There's some kids that come from a caste system. We stamp that out in Canada. So I would say it's difficult to say that the ideal is to where there's no inculcation, there's no imposition of culture. I don't think we could be together in a society unless we did have that
Mm-hmm.
some uniformity. And um, but 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 as a teacher, you've said that something that's really important to me. Um, and I talk myself about Socrates and asking questions and pointing it away. And I think that's really where Western civilization is most deeply rooted in ancient Greece. And now I know obviously before that too, but if anywhere, when you think of all the words that we use today that still come from like democracy and so forth, that come from the Greeks, it's really quite remarkable. And as a teacher, I just have views, and people can either accept them or reject them. But in the classroom, it's not about my views. I don't think that's very interesting for them. I think what's interesting for them is just to, when you're looking at a subject, is just to look at it from many different sides and try to understand it. And that's the goal. And we had the Dalai Lama apparently once said that the truth is a diamond, and all its facets taken together represent the entire truth. And so all I'm trying to do as a teacher, with Indigenous education, with Native education today, I, I don't really feel it should be different from them than from others, in the sense that I think that they have the same needs to one day get a job and parent well and all,
Mhm.
what to be a knowledgeable voter and all
Mhm.
these things. So I still think that most of what I would do. But if I have kids of any culture, particularly a culture that's highly represented in the classroom, I do everything I could to bring their culture into the instruction,
Mhm.
to bring their history into the instruction, to bring a novel, to bring art, whatever that's more emblematic of what they know. I
Mhm.
think I think teachers do that. I think so. It's really extraordinary to me. You use your word, hypocritical. I think there's so much has been done in recent decades to embrace diversity that it's extraordinary that the people who are now seeing themselves as the high priests of diversity and equity and inclusion, all these other things, are the very opposite, are the ones who are most openly in violation. They are violators of everything that they stand for. I believe in diversity. I believe that every child that comes into my classroom, whatever we're talking about, should come to his or her own conclusion. I think a lot of parents don't get that. A lot of parents have this idea that the kid needs to be like, no, no, really, the best thing for your child is to impart your values, give your kid all that you know that's good and true and beautiful and so forth. Do that, but don't see yourself as some sort of guru. You don't know what your child's true needs are. You know, the big children, we're all very complex. In the end, you got to accept your child as he or she is, and part of that is a thinking being. So I don't understand how the school system, right across Canada, because I would have been fired anywhere
Mhm.
in Canada at the time
Mhm.
for saying these things. I'm the only teacher in Canada that's been fired for this because all other teachers are smarter than I am and just shut up on a lot of these issues. But to me, is if you're an educator, the most important thing to do is to not be against learning stimuli.
Mhm.
And that's what they're doing, and killing great books and killing great ideas and killing accurate history. I think, well, what this is quarantine. I don't understand where all this is leading. I see a little bit of a 1984
Mhm.
Orwellian nightmare.
It's, your point about the the native cultures, the different cultures coming together, your point about your own past, your own family's history, being Irish, Gaelic, coming over, this process of assimilation into a new culture. It's it's fascinating to me that we have the dialogues we have right now around immigration and around culture and around assimilation. I kind of don't even know where to start because I'm just really interested in in this, and kind of surprised by some of what I'm seeing. That when you talk about these kids that come over from, say, like South Asian countries, and they have different cultural norms and different attitudes towards women, or whatever it might be, and you help them to adapt to the views and the norms of the Canadian culture instead, by saying, no, we're not going to punish homosexuality, we're not going to treat women as, or girls as, less important than boys, etc., and you're going to teach them the native languages of the place where you are. Well, that makes a lot of sense. However, if we as North Americans move ourselves like this is colonialist argument. If we were to go and take over their country and teach them to do things our way in their country, that would be the forced stamping out of somebody else's culture. And yet there's some of that going on right now in North America, where there's so much immigration into North America, and a lot of these, you're talking about an assimilation process, but was it it might have been in an interview I heard with you, where you talked about Canadian teachers being instructed not to tell other kids not to eat in front of Muslim students during Ramadan. So we've got some of that too. Like we're going to instruct you to adapt in some ways, but we're also going to force ourselves to. It seems very incoherent. Like the messaging is very strange to me right now. And that's not a very good question, but that's kind of a thought that I'm coming up with as I'm listening to you.
Well, you raise such intelligent points. There's cultural accommodation is a really fascinating thing, and it's been a big deal in Canada because we've been more of a. I would argue, your American, you might think a little differently. Your American audience may take this a little bit differently, but we in Canada refer to the U.S. more as a melting pot, and Canada more as a cultural mosaic. Whether there's any
Oh,
truth to that or not,
okay.
I don't know. But
That's a good
Canada,
visual.
but Canada does that. That we work really hard to give, different groups their day, and I'm sure there's no day in Canada that's not devoted to some group in some way. And then
Mm-hmm.
we have, like in the US, there's Black History Month, I believe in the US, but we have it here in Canada, and we have now we have Pride Month, and anyhow, so
Oh,
there's just whatever it is,
yeah.
the Canadians can't be faulted. Teachers like me can't be faulted for trying to be accommodative. I think that's what we do. We want to embrace and bring in and make every child in a classroom or school or society feel like he or she belongs. And
Mm-hmm.
that's good, but it's not easy. And there's some things that are very difficult. And I'll use one specific example. There was a 17-year-old girl on her birthday who was sitting in my class crying, Muslim girl from Afghanistan. And and I thought I had a good relationship with her. And and class was over, and she stayed in. She didn't get up. And I said to her, I sense you want to talk, and I'm happy to chat with you. But if I could just ask a question, you told me earlier that it was your birthday, and yet all you're doing is showing tremendous sadness. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, because I'm 17, my parents told me I have to marry my cousin. And she said, I want an education.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to marry my cousin. And she said her mother married a cousin, and one of her siblings is mentally disabled. Like this isn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
This is, we talked earlier about black and white, Manichaean, reductive. You can't see it. Nothing is easy. And I don't think, and this is what was lovely in the Winter Olympics in 2010, which were in Vancouver. And there was a beat poet, a spoken word artist,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you want to call him, on somebody, and he stood up and he said, Canada is a work in progress. We're really proud of who we are. But we know we're just a work in progress. We want to be better in this way and that way. And that's the humility that seems to be lost in this new woke world where cancel culture, where anybody who thinks differently is erased, and that's what's happened to me. I was told that I was a harm to students by saying that the kids weren't murdered. Well, I think you ultimately harm everybody by lying to them about the past, because then we will repeat it. We won't learn from it. That just is absolutely awful that some people can get into elected office or into position of leadership in an institution and all of a sudden think, what can I do to make a name for myself? And can manipulate all of us into believing the most absurd things. And in my particular case, the idea that teachers would murder a single kid and not talk about it, let alone 215 little kids, as they said, they're all little. because the graves are only about 2 feet deep.
Mm.
Well, they're only 2 feet deep because they weren't
So they're
graves.
not graves. If they're only 2 feet deep, that would be so easy to excavate. It just seems
No,
wild
yeah.
that
So
they
that's why
wouldn't
they
do
came
this.
with kids. It was only 2 feet deep. And
Yeah.
you're like, how easy would it be? And of course, you can't get anywhere near this apple orchard in the reserve because I've wanted to get in to save my career. I
Yeah.
want to get in my car and jump a fence and just dig and
Right.
prove to everybody that, so much of what we're being told about so many different things
Yeah.
are just absolute nonsense. Well, I just quick example, just on a different issue. Everyone's saying that, oh, we have to transition all these kids from boys to girls and girls to boys because they're depressed. But nobody says, oh, wait a second, is it going to make them less depressed to
Yeah.
change, to transition and become sterile
And to
and
have
have
medical
everybody be
problems for the
rejected and
rest of their
medical
life.
problems
Yeah.
and probably die young
Yeah.
and anyhow, so it's just all these things that you go, whoa, 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 hold on a second. If all these kids were
Yeah.
murdered, but of course you can't bury anyone 2 feet deep because animals will get the body.
Hmm.
So right, any absolutely everything about it.
Yeah.
But if I went to right now to the reserve to jump the fence,
Hmm.
there's security there 24/7. This is 3.5 years later. I can't send a drone above because the federal
Oh,
government has
wow.
prevented any aircraft, anything, surveillance possibility. They have a little museum there that's been closed for 3.5 years. And the archaeology report has been sealed by a local university. They're the ones that possess it now. Nobody's been able to see it. It was financed by the federal government. Nobody can see it. Absolutely everything is frozen for 3.5 years.
Oh,
And for one obvious reason, and I understand it to some extent, it's going to embarrass this First Nation. So I think it's not all poorly intended. And I'm
embarrass
not,
them how?
well, it's just such a monstrous lie
Oh, and
because
it was the
hundreds of
Kamloops
billions of
Nation.
dollars,
Okay.
hundreds of billions of dollars have already been spent in Canada as since 2021, since this, on all sorts of different things and
Mhm.
compensation. And we've adopted the United Nations UNDRIP, the Declaration of Race and Indigenous Peoples.
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
all these things, all these monumental changes. Land is going back, and there's new two classes of citizens in all these areas, and so much of this stems from one thing, one lie,
Well, it
and
seems
that
like
is
it's more embarrassing to the Canadian government at this point than that First Nation. I mean, they have really, they have, if they get definitive proof that there's nothing under the ground there but an old sewer line, this just their corruption will be so obvious. There will be no hiding from this. This is
but but who's going to report on it?
Mhm.
So we have major television networks,
This is them
CBC,
covering
CP.
their ass.
We have lots of big newspapers.
Hmm.
I'm the only teacher that's ever been fired for standing by honest history. Do you think anyone has any interviewed me? Do you think anyone's ever written about me? There's one national newspaper, but it's well known to be right of center. The one brave one, National Post. They wrote about my story. But even they are very, very nervous about it. And they write a lot of things that are just factually, it's not true. And
Hmm.
let me just say, come back to one thing when you said earlier about taking children away. I just want to make the point again that the children were never taken away. When the buffalo were no longer, again, this is a lot in the Canada's West is similar to the American West. There's a lot of prairie, a lot of plains, we call them in the North, and so that was a very big part of their diet. And then other things with settlers coming in, of course, there was going to be less fish and less deer and less all sorts of things. So there was starvation. And that's why Sitting Bull in 1777 came across. It wasn't just to escape from the US cavalry, but because people were hungry and they were looking for food. And so these schools, around that time, they started to negotiate with the different tribes and do treaties with them to figure out how to help them. And there was one thing that was in all these treaties. We want our children educated.
Hmm.
So for people to say as they do, well, yes, I know they're culturally, but we took the children. No, no, I don't think that's true at all. The chiefs and other representatives, the parents, they were clamoring to have their children have a better life than they.
Mm,
That's never changed. That's part of the human condition. That's why poor immigrants come to both our countries and work lousy jobs because they think their children are going to have an easier time in life.
mhm,
And so Indigenous people are just as smart,
mhm,
and they wanted a better life for their children. And they knew that the one ticket above all others is to get a good education. So and it's a right for kids today. So when someone says, oh, it's assimilation or it's a cultural whatever, imperialism, but all these terms, why do you have to paint it that way? Why don't you just go to these people? Indigenous kids in Canada are still getting the same education as non-Indigenous children. Now, maybe there's some adaptation and maybe there's a few schools where they educate themselves, but in almost all cases, they go to regular Canadian schools and have the same curriculum. So, in other words, it's not, they were never complaining about a cultural civilization. They were never complaining about being made into Christians. When the kids came to these residential schools 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, um, they came from Christian families. Indigenous people in Canada became Christian in large part long before residential schools, any schooling existed for them. And the biggest band in the Western Canada, where the residential schools were in greatest preponderance, are called the Cree. And have you heard the name Cree, I
mhm,
presume?
mhm,
And Cree means Christian.
mm,
It comes from in French, Christian is a chrétien, très. So it became the chrétien, and then it became Cré, and then just over time, Cré became
mm,
Cree. So anyhow, so it wasn't these missionaries who were there just slamming Western values and Christianity, including Christianity, into the heads of these poor native kids. It really wasn't that at all. It was, and they were inspected all the time, and they had parents coming into the school because these schools, like in Kamloops, were right in the middle of the reserve.
mhm,
They were just trying to give these kids the tools that allow them to survive. Now I know. Look, the whole picture. There's darkness, but there's only one priest that was ever convicted of sexual abuse
mm,
in all these schools over 150 years. Only one. And so, and I went to private school for a couple of years, and
mhm,
there were two convictions of teachers for sexual abuse.
mm,
It was after, but it was for what they had done with boys during the time that I was there. So my point is, there's so much hysteria
mhm,
on many subjects. And if we can just remove that and have what we're doing right now, Leslie, was just you're listening to me, and whether you agree with everything I say or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're listening to me, and what kind of world is it for kids if all teachers are saying things that are not only untrue but saying the very same things?
mm,
I would say the best education for children is one where you have the broadest possible set of perspectives and experiences. That's why a great novel is so amazing. To Kill a Mockingbird is essentially gone from North American schools. I know there's some place it exists. Could you imagine a better teacher than Atticus Finch,
mm,
than Boo Radley,
mhm,
than Scout Finch, than Tom Robinson? You've got so just in one book, you've got these different characters, different experiences, different viewpoints, different naiveties and failings and strengths, whatever. Like that's what a good school is. A good
mhm,
school is just to blend it all together and but they don't want that in schools. And I think
mhm,
increasingly they don't want that in society. They don't want anybody who's in opposition.
mhm, mhm. And it's, your point that you made earlier about how Canadian policy ends up really keeping stunting the growth or keeping in a childlike state the Indigenous population in a sense by providing them with opportunities not to take responsibility or not to grow as people. And you know going along with that, it really seems like these policy statements or these ideological statements around them really uses the Indigenous population as a bit of a human shield, like pointing to them and their victimhood, and don't we need to feel bad for them, and the 2S, the two spirit thing. We can concoct all kinds of ideas around what the Indigenous, but look at the poor Indigenous. And then behind that, they're doing all of these with these really imperialist policies that are quashing culture, quashing diversity, as you say, pointing to that, back to the hypocrisy of it all. One of the things that you, in your story, when I listened to your narration of what happened to you the day that you talked about what death was probably from in these times in these residential schools, that it probably wasn't murder. There's a good chance it was. If these are dead bodies under the ground, that it's more likely tuberculosis. One of the things that really stood out to me was that it was a student who ran from your classroom to go tattle on you because the students themselves were upset about being exposed to a different set of ideas that weren't supporting the narrative that they were accustomed to hearing. They wanted their teacher to teach them a certain perspective, and if not, they were already weaponized or empowered with the strength to go and tattle and have that teacher removed. So it's such an inversion of what should be happening in the classroom. And I know I just kind of you're giving me so much to think about, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I wish it were 3 hours long so I could lay out all of the different pieces and ask you about them. But
Can I just quickly just
yeah,
jump in on one thing?
please.
Because the same, you've said so much, and it's just such a delight chatting with you. Um, 2/3 of Indigenous people in Canada do not live on reserves. Is there any better evidence that these reserves are failing Indigenous people than
Mm,
the fact that many of their own people are escaping them?
mm,
So why don't we get rid of the reserve system? Why don't
mm,
we treat them and have the same responsibilities and the same same and everywhere as other Canadians? It's just anyhow, was proposed in 1969 by Pierre Trudeau, the father of our current Prime Minister Justin. And everybody said, racist, horrible. Wow, how can you dare take away their rights and all that kind of stuff? So here we are, and their situation really isn't any better all these years later because we're keeping them on these little reserves where there's so little opportunity and there's so much that's wrong. And in Kamloops, where they've now everybody's going, oh my gosh, there's all of this murder. The focus there is on for 3.5 years is on the tourism and then all the business that's created for
mm,
them, all the orange shirts they sell and around the world, by the way. They they've got all sorts of businesses flowing from this. The number one obviously is just coming up with stories and documenting them and getting more money from the Canadian government. And the most recent story that I read about a couple of days ago about one to wow, 70 years ago, I remember they took out. I spoke my native language one day to a friend, and somebody took out all my fingernails,
mm,
and you go okay, and of course it didn't happen, but this is it's the industry right now. The bigger the
mm,
story, the bigger the payout. And
mm,
so the biggest initiative in Canada among Indigenous people right now is to come up and to get every elder to come up with all sorts of stories of horror and to document this and to
because it's
start legal
incentivized.
claims. Yeah, yes. So that's what it is. It's not about educating their children. It's not about becoming sustainable. You mentioned earlier in this thing about the Eden, about the fact, they lived in a time and they didn't destroy, they didn't pave
Hmm.
over a
Hmm.
pave over a parking lot every 5 minutes. Well, maybe that's true in part. Maybe there are Indigenous people that want to live on the land and live as they used to live. But they can't do that if they're not preparing themselves for that.
Hmm.
It's just so wrong to make them into, all we've done is make them into angry activists.
Hmm.
And so again, I think it's important to recognize that the very best thing for all children, and this is me again speaking, people can disagree, forget what group they're part of. Yeah, I just
Hmm.
think I don't pay attention. You mentioned about Ramadan. You got to be when there's kids are starving. What they do in schools right now, they go, oh, Ramadan for a whole month. We have to support the kids who aren't drinking and eating. And you go, well, I just had a kid faint in class, or I just had a kid faint during soccer practice and is now in hospital. And they're going, no, 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 no. Ramadan's a good thing because it's cultural. We're multicultural. And I go, well, is it good for the kid? Is it really good for a kid not to be eating and drinking? And what I find interesting about schools and even about Muslim culture is it's changing. There are more and more people saying, oh, no, 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 no. During Ramadan, children can eat and drink
Hmm.
during the day. And now it's a serious issue in Canada because sometimes Ramadan falls in June. And June in Canada, because we're farther north than you
Hmm.
guys, you can live in areas where it's never dark
Hmm.
or it's
Mm.
dark for an
Oh
hour.
gosh.
And so if you actually impose upon people no drinking or eating
From
during daylight
sunrise to
hours,
sunset. Yeah.
you will actually kill people.
Yeah.
Now I know people find ways around it,
Yeah.
but this is the way.
For
And
little
so
kids,
nobody's,
that's yeah.
but because of political correctness, because of this wokeism, people are not going, well, maybe the cultural practice isn't a good one.
Hmm.
They just are trying to work everything around the cultural practice, and I'm going, I'm a rational person. I'm going to say things that are rational, that children should not be deprived at any time food or drink if they need it.
Hmm.
And some can die, and kids do die from that. So that's me. And the school systems, our society is not ready. Oh no, you can't say anything critical unless it's a white Christian. Then you
Hmm.
can go to town and just say all sorts of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Are we going to get to the point where you can't have any meat in schools because of the vegans? And a lot of there are schools where they are thinking about that. So it's interesting where to what extent does one accommodate? And my feeling is I always have subscribed to the idea of free society.
Hmm.
If people come in here, then they can not eat meat or they can not drink or what do all sorts of things.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they have a right to impose that upon
Hmm.
others.
Hmm.
And so if an indigenous person is in my classroom, let's say the student that ran out and chatted with me wasn't indigenous. I don't believe was. But let's say she was indigenous, and let's say I was saying something that generally upset her. Um, then I would do my best with her as an individual to accommodate her. And because
Hmm.
I'm trying to educate her, not upset her.
Right.
So I would never say, no, no, you have to know it wasn't murder, it
Hmm.
was disease, and you can't say and you're wrong. You don't do that. You just say,
Hmm.
well, I'd just like to introduce to you, which is my job as a teacher, um, some a counterpoint, and that's how we get better as thinkers by testing, and that's how I would have approached it with her. I wouldn't, but what they wanted me to do in my school yesterday, they said, no, no, it wasn't just that you upset a student. You can never do what you do. You can never do because what you're saying is taboo.
Hmm.
You can never say something that goes against what we're saying. And what we're saying right now, I'll just get away from indigenous issues. What we're
Hmm.
saying right now is there's no such thing as boys and girls.
Hmm.
And teachers in Canada, like I wish there are many, thousands, tens of probably, I don't know, I'm guessing tens of thousands, probably 50,000. None of us can say there's only two genders, boys and girls, bisexual. This is how nature is, plants and so on.
Hmm.
You can't do that. You just can't do that because schools are being so captured by people who not only have no respect for diversity and inclusion, but they have no respect for truth. And a society without truth or a relationship without truth.
Hmm.
Now, if you found out that some of the things I'm saying to you aren't true, I don't think you'd ever interview me again.
Hmm.
I think that would be the deal breaker between in our relationship,
Hmm.
Leslie, that's an hour
Hmm.
old. I don't think you would ever have anything to do with me again. You go, he's a liar. He's making things up.
Hmm.
But if you find out that everything that I've said to you today is true, that these schools were negotiated with indigenous people so
Hmm.
that children can have a chance at an education, a modern education, and getting a job one day and so forth. Um, Anyhow, I just find it absolutely fascinating that they say Native people are truth tellers. This is
Mhm.
the keepers of the truth and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, well, I bet many are.
Mhm.
So, but many aren't.
Mhm.
And many of us aren't. My government is full of people who are not truth keepers.
Mhm.
And that's my goal. And I fail. And often, as we all do, because I learn that maybe there's something that I don't know well enough, or
Mhm.
things have changed, whatever. And what I do and what we do in the scientific age is we go, oh, okay.
Mhm.
Thank you for telling me that now I know how to pronounce that word or whatever. I have kids that say, "My Mr. McMurtry, I think you got that wrong." I go, "Well, tell me why you got it wrong." And I'm got a smile on my face. I'm going, "This is fantastic because this is
Mhm.
what I want you to do. I
Mhm.
don't want you to have me do your thinking.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you." And what is it that I said wrong? And I might say, well, maybe it's a question of perspective, but there's sometimes that I just get things flat wrong. No, that wasn't 2021, Miss McMurtry. It was 2019.
Mhm.
Like, sorry, guys, I'm fallible. But the woke don't do that. My employer, my regulatory body that wants to ban me from life from teaching, and will succeed because I'm old enough now. And it's been 5 years, so I'm unlikely since my problem started. But there's just no way that I'm going to be in a classroom again. And what I find it interesting, they have no humility. They have no sense of fallibility. And I think that is the essence to being a good person,
Mhm.
is recognizing that you're not better than the people around you,
Mhm.
that you're just that's very Christian. And I don't know what I am spiritually. But I love that about Christianity.
Mhm.
I think Christ was a tremendous example. He didn't go around telling people you have to think like him, or
Mhm.
you're out of a job, or you're
Mhm.
out of this set, out of our religion. It was all about accommodating.
Mhm. Mhm. I
But
think
anyhow,
that openness that you described to exploration, humility, that I liked when you said what did you say? You were there to educate, not anger her. You're not there to aggravate and provoke a student. You're there to educate them. So if something's not hitting right, or you can see that they're frustrated or angry about something, that then you go in and you explore that with them and talk more. It opens more dialogue. It's not about shutting down and indoctrinating and forcing. And I think as parents, many of us have that perspective that we're going to leave the questions are open. We're not forcing our perspectives on our children, and then we send them off to school naive to the fact that the school's not taking that same approach with our kids. They are oftentimes really forcing these perspectives, and that can be a real I guess moment of disillusionment as a parent when you find that the people that you've trusted with your kids have not been using that same open approach that you're describing, that I think we would want in our teachers. That seems to me like the ideal of education. And there's so much in what you said. I kind of come back to the process is similar with all of there's a simultaneous, it's almost a deification of the marginalized person, right? So there's like this they can do no wrong, they are the source of good and truth, and they really know. Like when you talked about the indigenous person as the keeper of the truth, it kind of reminds me of some of the gender ideology where it's like, no, the trans person knows, they know. And so there's this idealization, this elevation to something above the normal human condition, or the certainly the white American or North American condition, or the Westerner condition. But simultaneously, this infantilization and this, we all must band together to protect them because they're more fragile, they can't handle. So it's a really interesting bifurcation. And I think, for me anyway, we can get so steeped in the dialogues in our own that we're surrounded by. The Canadian example of what's going on with Indigenous, and we didn't even get into the land acknowledgement, so that maybe we can have another conversation sometime if you want. But what's going on in Canada around the Indigenous population, it's so fascinating to kind of see that same pattern playing out, but with a subject that's a little different. So we can watch it play out and really see all of the conflicts that are inherent in this ideological process, and there's so much internal conflict in this, and so much rhetorical fallacy. And what an interesting time to be alive. What an interesting time to watch culture changing and see what's happening. It's alarming, it's shocking, it's awful. And if thinking people survive this era, the books that will be written about this time will be quite interesting.
If I could close on this one note. So I've mentioned 1984 a few times because I'm part of what has inspired me in life aren't human beings, it's literary characters. And that book, I think, had a deep imprint. And you mentioned quickly on acknowledgments. Allow me to say one thing. To me, they became, as was seen in 1984, 2 minutes of hate. It's not about acknowledging there were people living here before us. It's become all about hate. The injustices that are being committed in the past and currently. And so I think there's an awful lot that people need to be outraged by. And what shocks me is that here I am. I'm pretty much alone, Leslie. I don't hear from anybody. So it's lovely chatting with you. I really don't hear from anybody. I don't even hear from my union lawyer. And again, it was 3.5 years that I last taught. So it's pretty outrageous. However, allow me to say this in a positive way. They're wrong because they're educationally wrong. All the things that you've said, that I've said, they're educationally wrong. So I know when books are written about this period, maybe there'll be a book that mentions me. And it's going to say, that teacher suffered for a long time and he never taught again. But he made people think that maybe it wasn't right to silence somebody with an opposing view.
Well, I hope that book is written, and I hope that story is told. I think it's really important. I think it's a shame that you're not all over the news in Canada, and that you don't have a ton of support for what you're voicing. And I hope that will change. I hope that you said something about some of the edifice crumbling. I hope it continues to, and that more people will listen to stories like yours. I think it's so important. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Leslie.
And if we were local, I know a lot of homeschoolers who could really use tutors. I don't know if that's something that goes on in Canada, but that's something that my homeschool group has recently been talking about. We'd love to have somebody who comes in and tutors a day a week for our kids. And I don't know, maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but I hope that there's some way that you can connect with people who could really use your skill set. So
thank you very much. I feel that I have a bit of a role right now on Twitter.
Oh, speaking of which, how can people find you? What's your Twitter handle, and what are the other links that you'd like to reference?
Just the Twitter would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, there's the video on the top, and I'm Jim McMurtry 01.
01, as in numeral 0, numeral 1. Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Fantastic. I'll include the link in this description of this video.
So this is all over, right? This isn't being tapered.
Oh, we're still recording, but I'll hit stop.
No, I didn't know. I didn't know. It's good.
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you again. But
yeah.
Because I think in the end, I'm going to sound more confident here than will you continue with this or not. But I'm not going to lose. I'm not going to lose because the truth does have a funny way of surfacing. And And you have to do what's right by children, or you have no business being in a school. Just think how many kids. I had one mother contact me early in this case, and I posted things about the trans thing in schools. And I think that's more upsetting than my particular issue. But
Mhm.
there's lots of things that are upsetting. Um, but she said that her daughter had four friends who are transitioning, and that you still get people out
Wow.
there going, "Oh no, it's gender dysphoria." Oh, okay. So if there's a 5,000% increase all of a sudden in classes, and so one day it's we're going to look back at this and say, how did this was criminal?
Mm.
What is being done to children in schools is criminal, and that's not that's very sad for me because I believe in public education. I believe in any form of education. So I think it's just very, very sad time.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Jim. I hope maybe we can do it again in the future.
It'd be a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you, Leslie.